The story opens with firefighter specialist Daniel Cooper standing in the observation deck of the Royal Spire on the planet Cathara, capital world of the Kithran Empire, trying not to look as uncomfortable as he felt. He'd been assigned to the Royal Complex as part of a Terran military exchange program, humans providing technical expertise in emergency response while learning Kithran protocols. It was supposed to be a boring 6-month rotation, attend formal ceremonies, maintain equipment that rarely got used, maybe train some Kithran guards in human firefighting techniques. Boring, safe, professional development that looked good on a service record without actually involving much risk. That comfortable assumption had lasted exactly 4 months and 3 days before the sabotage attack hit. Daniel had been conducting a routine inspection of suppression systems in the lower levels when the explosion ripped through the Royal Spire's eastern wing. His combat training kicked in immediately. Assess the situation, identify threats, prioritize response. The Spire's internal alarms were screaming about structural damage, fire in the sacred flame zone, and shield failure in the royal quarters. Through the observation windows, Daniel could see the eastern tower engulfed in flames, not normal fire, but some kind of chemical accelerant that burned with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. His emergency radio crackled. "All personnel, this is command. Sabotage confirmed. The princess is trapped in the eastern tower. Emergency shields have failed. The sacred flame zone protocols are in effect." The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Daniel ran toward the emergency lockers, grabbing his thermal gear while his brain processed what he'd just heard. Princess Kira was trapped in a burning tower. The sacred flame zone was a Kithran cultural thing, areas of the royal complex where only those with royal blood were permitted during emergencies, something about maintaining the purity of royal spaces during crisis. Guards would be waiting for authorization from the Queen before entering, because violating sacred protocols could mean execution. His radio crackled again. "All Terran personnel, stand by for evacuation. Do not interfere with Kithran emergency response. This is a cultural matter." Daniel stopped listening and started running toward the eastern tower. He reached the entrance to find a cluster of Kithran royal guards standing outside the sealed doors, their expressions cycling between horror and helpless fury. The senior guard, Commander Vex, whose honor marks indicated 3 decades of service, was arguing frantically with someone over his communication device. "The princess is inside. We need authorization to breach the sacred flame zone. Yes, I understand protocol, but she's dying. No, I cannot violate the covenant without the Queen's direct order." Daniel didn't have the cultural baggage. Didn't have honor marks that meant he'd spent decades learning what he couldn't do. Didn't have protocols written into his genetic memory through Kithran evolutionary psychology that made certain actions physically difficult to contemplate. He had thermal gear, emergency training, and a princess who was going to die if someone didn't act in the next 60 seconds. "Commander Vex," he said, pulling on his thermal helmet. "I'm going in." Vex had turned, his expression shifting from anguish to shock. "Firefighter Cooper, you cannot. The sacred flame zone, only royal blood may enter during. I'm human. Your sacred flame zone protocols don't apply to me." Daniel had sealed his helmet, checked his oxygen supply, and grabbed a thermal axe from the emergency locker. "Where in the tower is she?" "The meditation chamber, 3rd level, eastern face." Vex's voice had been strained. "But the stairs have collapsed. You'll have to climb through the gallery across the bridge that's already half destroyed. I'll figure it out." Daniel had approached the sealed doors. "Can you unseal this, or do I break through?" Vex had stared at him for a long moment, then made a decision that probably violated half a dozen protocols. "May your gods protect you, human, because ours will offer no mercy if you fail." He'd unsealed the doors. Heat had rolled out like a physical wall, temperatures that would have killed an unprotected person instantly. Through his helmet's heads-up display, Daniel could see the interior of the tower. A spiral gallery that had been elegant architecture 3 minutes ago and was now a death trap of falling debris and toxic smoke. He'd entered without hesitation. The interior of the eastern tower was hell rendered in crystal and flame. Kithran architecture favored elaborate crystalline structures that were beautiful in peace and absolutely lethal in crisis. The burning crystals released toxic compounds, the melting structures became razor-sharp shrapnel, and the collapsed geometry created unpredictable pockets of superheated air that could cook someone alive. Daniel's thermal suit was rated for extreme temperatures, but it wasn't designed for Kithran chemical fires, which meant he had maybe 10 minutes before the suit's integrity failed, and he started taking real damage. He climbed through the gallery, using his axe to clear debris and create purchase points where the elegant spiral stairs had collapsed into rubble. His heads-up display showed temperature readings climbing into ranges that made his suit's alarm system scream warnings. 3 minutes in, he'd reached the bridge Vex had mentioned, a span of crystalline material that had been architectural art, and was now a half-melted structure spanning a drop of approximately 30 meters into flames below. Half the bridge was gone, the other half was actively collapsing, and crossing it was objectively insane. Daniel had started across it anyway. The crystal had groaned under his weight, pieces falling away into the inferno below. He'd made it halfway before a section gave way completely, and only his training, grab anything, arrest your fall, don't panic, had saved him from plummeting. He'd caught himself on a support beam that was still mostly solid, pulled himself up, and continued. At the far end of the bridge, the meditation chamber's entrance was blocked by fallen debris. Through the gaps, Daniel could see Princess Kira, recognizable from the formal briefings he'd sat through, though those briefings hadn't mentioned she'd looked terrified and determined in equal measure when trapped in a burning tower. She'd been trying to shift rubble with her bare hands, her formal robes torn and burned, her honor marks, the intricate patterns that marked Kithran royal status, smudged with ash. Princess Kira. Daniel had shouted through his helmet's external speakers, "I'm here to extract you, move back from the door." She'd stared at him like he was an hallucination. "You're human. You shouldn't be in the sacred flame zone." "Yeah, I'm getting that a lot today. Move back." He'd used his thermal axe to break through the debris, creating an opening large enough to reach through and start pulling away rubble from the other side. Princess Kira had helped, working with strength that suggested Kithran physiology was more robust than it looked. They'd cleared enough space for her to squeeze through, and Daniel had gotten his first close look at her condition. Burns on her arms, smoke inhalation making her breathing labored, one of her legs clearly injured based on how she favored it. "Can you walk?" he'd asked. "I can try. Not good enough. We're 50 meters up in a collapsing tower with maybe 5 minutes before the whole structure comes down. I'm carrying you. I'm a princess of the Kithran Empire. And you're also injured, and we're both going to die if we waste time arguing about dignity." Daniel had turned around. "Climb on my back. Lock your arms around my neck. Don't let go no matter what happens." She'd hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, then done it. Daniel had felt the weight settle. Kithrans were lighter than humans of equivalent size, their biology optimized for their homeworld's lower gravity, and started the journey back. The bridge was worse on the return trip. More sections had collapsed. The remaining structure was barely holding, and Daniel was carrying extra weight that shifted his center of gravity in ways that made every step a calculated risk. He'd made it 3/4 across before the bridge gave way completely. One moment he was walking on crystal that groaned but held. The next moment he was falling, Princess Kira's arms locked around his neck, his training screaming at him to grab something, anything. His hand had caught a support cable, decorative architecture that had become an emergency lifeline. The jolt had nearly dislocated his shoulder, pain exploding through his arm, but he'd held on. Had used his other hand to grab the axe he'd somehow kept through the fall, swung it into the tower wall to create a second anchor point, and started climbing one-handed while Princess Kira held on. "Don't look down," he'd said, mostly to keep her focused. "Don't think about falling, just hold on." "You're insane," she'd managed through labored breathing. "Humans don't have sense-preservation instincts." "We have excellent sense-preservation instincts. We just also have save people first, worry about dying later instincts that sometimes override them." He'd reached a ledge, pulled them both up, and continued toward the gallery entrance. The gallery was collapsing faster now, entire sections of the tower's structure giving way as the fire compromised load-bearing elements. Daniel had navigated through falling crystal and superheated air pockets that made his suit's alarms reach new octaves of panic. He'd made it to the entrance, where Commander Vex and a dozen guards were waiting with medical equipment and expressions that suggested they couldn't believe what they were seeing, and stumbled through just as the tower's upper sections imploded behind them. Medical personnel had swarmed immediately, pulling Princess Kira away to assess her injuries, surrounding Daniel to check his condition. His suit was compromised in 3 places. He had second-degree burns on his right arm where superheated gas had penetrated the suit's integrity. His shoulder was definitely dislocated from catching that fall, and his lungs felt like he'd inhaled fire despite the suit's air supply. But he was alive. Princess Kira was alive. Mission accomplished. He'd collapsed onto the floor, exhaustion and pain catching up with adrenaline, and heard Commander Vex's voice. "The Queen is coming. She witnessed everything from the command center. She'll want to speak with you." "Great," Daniel had managed. "Should I salute or just pass out?" "Neither would be advisable, human. What you did entering the sacred flame zone, violating protocols that have stood for 10,000 years, saving the princess." Vex's voice had carried something between awe and horror. "You've changed everything." Daniel had been moved to a private medical suite and treated for his injuries. The burns were manageable. The dislocated shoulder was reset with Kithran medical techniques that hurt worse than the original injury, and the smoke inhalation was being addressed with drugs that made him feel disconnected from reality. He'd been given approximately 30 minutes to process what had happened before Queen Saria entered the medical suite with an entourage that included high-ranking nobles, military commanders, and what looked like religious officials whose robes suggested they dealt with sacred traditions. Princess Kira was with them, looking much better than she had in the burning tower, her burns treated, her breathing normal, her honor marks restored to their proper ceremonial appearance. She met Daniel's eyes with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, gratitude mixed with something that looked like concern or possibly terror. Queen Saria was exactly as imposing as diplomatic briefings had suggested, tall even by Kithran standards, with honor marks that covered most of her visible skin in intricate patterns denoting millennia of royal lineage. Her presence filled the room with the kind of authority that made everyone unconsciously straighten their posture. "Firefighter Specialist Daniel Cooper," she said, and her voice carried formal ceremonial weight. "You entered the sacred flame zone. You violated protocols that have protected royal sanctity for 10,000 years. You risked your life to save my daughter when protocol required you to wait for authorization that might have come too late." Daniel tried to sit up straighter, failed because his shoulder protested violently, and settled for meeting the Queen's gaze as directly as he could manage. "Your Majesty, I didn't think about protocols. I saw someone who needed help and I had the training to provide it. That seemed more important than waiting for permission." "You saw someone who needed help," the Queen repeated, and something in her tone made Daniel's stomach tighten. "Without calculating whether saving her would violate our laws or endanger your own standing with your government or compromise diplomatic relationships. You simply acted because it was right." "Yes, Your Majesty. This is what we have observed about humans," the Queen said, addressing her entourage now as much as Daniel. "They do not wait for authorization. They do not calculate political implications. When lives are endangered, they act immediately according to their conscience. This quality makes them unpredictable, difficult to work with, frequently frustrating to govern alongside. She turned back to Daniel. It also makes them capable of heroism that transcends cultural boundaries. You saved my daughter, firefighter Cooper. In doing so, you fulfilled an ancient covenant that our people have honored since before we reached the stars. One of the religious officials stepped forward, carrying what looked like a ceremonial text projected on a data crystal. The rescuer's bond, the official intoned. Established in the reign of Queen Kithara I, 10,000 years past. It decrees, should any being, regardless of origin or status, preserve the life of a royal heir at cost to their own well-being and survival, they shall be bound to that heir in recognition that the crown's future has been entrusted to them. The official looked at Daniel. You entered an inferno that should have killed you. You suffered injuries that will take months to fully heal. You risked everything, your life, your career, your future, to save Princess Kiera. By our most ancient laws, you have fulfilled the rescuer's bond. What does that mean? Daniel asked, though a sinking feeling suggested he wasn't going to like the answer. Queen Saria's expression was unreadable. It means that you are now bound to my daughter by covenant that supersedes normal law. Your fate and hers are intertwined. The crown's future has been placed in your hands by your own actions. She paused, and when she spoke next, her voice carried absolute authority. Before these witnesses, before my nobles and my people, I declare, firefighter specialist Daniel Cooper and Princess Kiera will be married. This is not punishment. It is recognition of what has already occurred. You have claimed responsibility for her life by preserving it. That responsibility now extends to her future and the future of our throne. The room had erupted in shocked murmurs. Daniel's brain had stopped processing reality. Wait, married? Your Majesty, I just pulled her out of a fire. That doesn't mean. It means exactly this, the Queen interrupted. The rescuer's bond is not metaphor or ceremony. It is binding covenant. You saved my daughter knowing you might die in the attempt. That sacrifice has consequences, and one of those consequences is that you are now recognized as the being most qualified to stand beside her as she assumes her duties. Princess Kiera had stepped forward, her expression cycling through emotions too complex to track. Mother, surely we can consider, this human didn't know about the bond. He acted on instinct, not with intent to claim. Intent is irrelevant, the Queen said firmly. Actions matter, outcomes matter. He acted with such courage and selflessness that our laws recognize him as worthy of standing beside the throne. This is not negotiable, Kiera. The bond has been fulfilled. The marriage will occur. She turned to Daniel. I understand this is not what you anticipated when you entered that tower. You thought you were performing a rescue, not claiming a princess. But the rescuer's bond exists precisely because our people believe that those who will risk everything for another are those who deserve to share that person's future. Your Majesty, Daniel had managed, I'm a human firefighter. I'm not trained for whatever being married to a princess involves. I'm not qualified. You're qualified because you dove into an inferno to save her, the Queen interrupted. Everything else can be learned. Your courage cannot be taught. You either possess it or you don't. You've demonstrated that you possess it in abundance. One of the noble officials had objected. Your Majesty, with respect, binding the princess to an alien who knows nothing of our culture, who has no royal blood, who violated sacred protocols. He violated those protocols to save my daughter's life. The Queen had cut him off coldly. If our sacred protocols would require waiting while a princess burns to death, then perhaps our protocols are less sacred than we believed. This human saw past tradition to fundamental morality. That quality is exactly what our throne needs. She gestured, and attendants had approached with formal robes, ceremonial garments that Daniel recognized from diplomatic briefings as the kind worn during binding ceremonies. The wedding will occur in 3 days. That gives time for healing, for preparation, and for both of you to come to terms with this reality. The Queen's expression had softened slightly. I know this is overwhelming, but the bond is binding. You saved her life. Now you will share it. That is our law, and it will not be set aside. Daniel had looked at Princess Kira, who was staring at him with an expression that might have been gratitude or terror or both. Do I get any say in this? He'd asked quietly. You had your say when you entered the sacred flame zone, the Queen replied. The choice was made then. Now we honor the consequences. The 3 days before the wedding passed in a haze of medical treatment, diplomatic briefings, and increasingly surreal conversations about what being married to an alien princess would actually entail. Daniel's chain of command had been simultaneously delighted and horrified by the situation. His commanding officer had sent a message that essentially said, "Congratulations on strengthening interspecies relations. Also, what the hell were you thinking entering a burning tower without authorization? Also, your marriage is being treated as a significant diplomatic event, and we're all going to pretend this was planned." The Terran diplomatic corps had gone into overdrive trying to understand the rescuers' bond and its implications. Apparently the law was ancient, rarely invoked, and absolutely binding once the criteria were met. There had been exactly 3 instances in recorded Kithran history of the bond being fulfilled, all involving Kithrans saving other Kithrans. Daniel was the first non-Kithran to trigger it, which was causing considerable debate among scholars about whether the law applied to aliens or only to Kithran citizens. Queen Saria had settled that debate quickly. The law does not specify species, it specifies actions. Cooper fulfilled the criteria. The bond applies. Princess Kira had visited him on the 2nd day, arriving without the usual entourage of attendants and guards. She'd sat down in the chair beside his medical bed, her honor marks showing patterns that Daniel's limited cultural knowledge couldn't fully interpret. "I wanted to speak with you," she'd said. "Without my mother or the court officials or anyone trying to manage this situation. Just the 2 beings who are about to have their lives permanently altered." "I appreciate that," Daniel had said. "Because I'm still processing what's happening and I suspect you are too." Processing is an understatement. Kira's honor marks had shifted to show patterns Daniel thought might indicate stress or uncertainty. "You saved my life. I'm grateful, more grateful than I can adequately express. But the rescuer's bond, marriage, binding our futures together, that's not something I wanted any more than you did. So we're both trapped by an ancient law because I didn't know about it when I pulled you out of a burning tower." Yes, she'd paused, though trapped isn't quite accurate. The bond exists to recognize that you already claimed responsibility for my life. In our culture, that's not a casual thing. You risked death to preserve me. That action created obligation that extends beyond the immediate rescue. But I didn't intend. Intent doesn't matter in Kithran law. Actions matter. You acted with such courage that our laws recognize you as worthy of standing beside the throne. Kira's honor marks had shifted again. "I understand that's unfair by human standards. You performed a heroic act and now you're being rewarded with responsibilities you never wanted." Daniel had thought about this. "It's definitely not the outcome I expected when I ran into that tower, but," he'd paused, choosing words carefully, "I'm not entirely convinced it's wrong." Kira had looked surprised. "You're not. I made a choice to save your life. I knew I might die doing it. I did it anyway because letting you burn to death was unacceptable." Daniel had met her gaze. If that choice created obligations beyond the immediate rescue, if saving your life means taking responsibility for your future, I'm not sure that's unreasonable. It's just more than I was thinking about when I was climbing through a burning tower. Most humans would resent being bound by laws they didn't know existed, Kira had observed. "I'm not thrilled about it," Daniel had admitted. "But I'm also not going to claim I should get the benefit of having saved you without accepting any of the costs that come with that choice. That seems dishonest." Kira's honor marks had shown patterns that might have been respect. That's remarkably mature for someone who's being forced into marriage with an alien princess. I'm good at adapting to situations I don't fully understand. It's kind of a human specialty. He'd shifted in the medical bed, his shoulder still protesting movement. What about you? How are you processing this? I'm angry that my mother is enforcing an ancient law without considering whether it's appropriate for modern circumstances, Kira had said honestly. I'm grateful that you saved my life. I'm terrified about what it means to be bound to someone I barely know. And she'd paused, I'm intrigued by the human who dove into an inferno without hesitation because it was the right thing to do. Intrigued is good, intrigued I can work with. You're handling this remarkably well. I'm really not, Daniel had said. I'm just good at appearing calm while internally panicking, another human specialty. Kira had actually smiled at that. Perhaps we can both panic quietly together while figuring out what this marriage actually means. That sounds like a plan. The wedding itself had been elaborate, public, and attended by enough dignitaries that Daniel's security briefings suggested there were approximately 12 different ways the ceremony could turn into a diplomatic incident. He'd worn formal robes that felt like wearing architecture, stood beside Princess Kira in the grand ceremonial chamber, and repeated words in Kithran that he'd practiced phonetically without fully understanding their meaning. The ceremony had incorporated both Kithran traditions and hastily adapted human elements that the diplomatic corps had insisted on including. There had been formal declarations, the presentation of the rescuers' bond as sacred covenant, and Queen Saria pronouncing them bound by law and fate. Through it all, Daniel had been hyper-aware of Princess Kira beside him, her honor marks showing patterns that cycled between ceremonial calm and what he was learning to recognize as genuine nervousness, her hand occasionally brushing his in what might have been deliberate reassurance or might have been accident. When the ceremony concluded, they were married, bound by ancient law that Daniel had triggered by diving into flames to save a princess he hadn't known. The celebration afterward had been overwhelming, nobles congratulating them, diplomatic officials treating the marriage as a significant political victory, religious leaders declaring it as proof that the rescuers' bond remained sacred even in modern times. Daniel had navigated it all with the same approach he'd used for the burning tower. Focus on immediate objectives, don't overthink the situation, deal with consequences later. It wasn't until much later, when they were finally alone in quarters that had been prepared for them, essentially a small apartment within the royal complex, furnished with a confusing mix of Kithran and hastily acquired human elements, that the reality fully settled in. We're married, Kira had said, standing in the center of the main room and looking as lost as Daniel felt. We are, Daniel had confirmed, to each other, because I pulled you out of a fire and your culture has ancient laws about that. It sounds absurd when you say it that directly. Most things sound absurd when you strip away the formal language. Daniel had sat down carefully, his shoulder still protesting. So what happens now? Now we figure out how to make this work, Kira had said. The bond is binding. The marriage is legal. We're committed to each other whether we wanted this or not. We can choose to resent it, or we can choose to build something meaningful from circumstances neither of us controlled. You've thought about this. I've had 3 days to think about very little else. She'd sat down across from him. You saved my life, Daniel. That matters more than the awkwardness of how we arrived at this marriage. I was dying in that tower. You risked everything to prevent that. I won't dishonor that sacrifice by treating this bond as a burden. I won't dishonor your trust by treating you as an obligation I was forced to accept, Daniel had replied. You're not a duty. You're a person I chose to save. If that choice comes with responsibilities, then I'll honor them. Kira's honor marks had